All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to Off Script, NPR's series of conversations between 2020 Democratic candidates and undecided voters from across the country. I'm Noel King, and today we are in New York City with Andrew Yang, who is an entrepreneur and presidential hopeful. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I want to introduce our two voters. Hethel Johnny runs a nonprofit here in New York City. It's focused on education and mentorship. She's 36 years old, and she's the daughter of immigrants from India. Yep. Hethel, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Where'd you grow up, Hethel?
Here in New York City.
Wow. What part?
Queens, Flushing. Yeah.
My wife's from Bayside.
Oh, very cool.
Nice. And John Zeitler is an attorney for an insurance company. He lives in northern New Jersey, but like a lot of people, he commutes into the city for work. He's 48 years old, and he is the dad of twin boys who are 11. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, so we are in New York's Flatiron District. We're in a restaurant called Bodega.
I know, so clever.
You picked the place.
Well,
What do you love
I'm
about
very
it?
wise because this place is delicious. It's got a very clever name. Yeah, I hope everyone else is enjoying it as much as I am. Bodega, New York City, 7 West 20th Street.
People do seem to be liking. People do seem to be liking the food. How long have you been coming here?
I've only been here once, but enjoyed the food when I was here, and so I need to bring my wife. I actually came here without her. Sort of a problem because my wife's a huge foodie. Not huge foodie, not like in terms of like consuming excellent food, just consuming food.
Yeah.
You owe her a trip.
So I do owe her a trip.
All right, before we get to the hard questions, do either of you guys have any fun stuff you'd like to ask Mr. Yang?
Yeah, so I saw yesterday and Ask Me Anything, you ended with a question about anime, right? Your favorite
I
anime?
didn't end on that. It was somewhere in the middle, but go on.
Oh, sorry about that. What's your go-to karaoke song?
Don't You Forget About Me by Simple Minds from the Breakfast Club soundtrack.
Yeah, very cool.
And then When Doves Cry by Prince would be a close runner-up.
Can you give
you
us a
belt it
couple
out?
bars?
Yeah.
How can you just leave me standing alone in a world that's so cold? It's like Prince himself is here singing them.
Yeah. Purple Rain.
John, how about you?
I noticed you rode your bike in to the restaurant today with the baby seat on the back. Is that how you tool
bike with a
around?
baby seat. That's what he means, not like motorbike or something cool. Yes, I did.
Do you always travel around on the bike?
I do. My younger son is 4, so I still bike him to school, and I relish that because he's going to outgrow it pretty soon. Like my older is turning 7, and he outgrew the bike seat a couple of years ago. So I ride him to school in the morning anytime I'm in town if I have the time, and I find it much more fun to get around in New York City on the bike than sitting in traffic.
Sure.
Better exercise, you have to try and get your exercise where you can.
Do you wear a helmet?
I do.
Thank
I'd be
you.
a very bad role model.
Thank
my
you.
Kid. And my kid has, my sons have the little bike helmets too, very cute.
Too many New Yorkers don't wear helmets, and it makes me deeply, deeply anxious.
I am running for president. Have to be a good role model. Can't have being like, yeah, I think I just saw Andrew Yang. Come
Right.
buy helmetless. I guess I don't need mine. Just like you don't need a tie. Just kidding.
All right, I want to start us off by asking about your signature policy proposal, the thing that has gotten you a lot of attention. Many people will know it as universal basic income. You call it the freedom dividend.
Yep.
And what it means basically is that every American adult, if you're elected, ages 18 to 64, will get $1,000 a month from the government, no strings attached, to do whatever they want with.
Yes. No, it's actually 18 till death now.
It's 18 till death now. That's an update. Okay.
Yes.
So
We
there's a
changed that
reason.
number months ago.
A couple months ago. You think that this is necessary for a reason. Can you spend a couple of minutes laying out why you think this bold proposal is so necessary?
I spent 7 years running a nonprofit that I'd started that helped create jobs in the Midwest and the South primarily, helped create several thousand jobs. And I saw that we are in the midst of the greatest economic transformation in our country's history, what experts are calling the fourth industrial revolution. I'm convinced that Donald Trump won in 2016 because of the early waves of the fourth industrial revolution, where we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Iowa, all the swing states he needed to win. And now that set of changes is shifting to retail. 30% of stores and malls are closing, primarily because of Amazon. And being a retail clerk is the most common job in most of the country. The average retail clerk's a 39-year-old woman making between $9 and $10 an hour. So when her store closes, there aren't a ton of options. We're getting rid of call center workers, of which there are 2.5 million in the U.S., making $14 an hour. Soon we will start replacing truck drivers, and being a trucker is the most common job in many states. There are 3.5 million truck drivers, average age 49, 94% men. And there are another 7 million Americans who work in the truck stops, motels, and diners that serve the truckers. So if we do nothing, we are going to be in for much worse than Donald Trump's election, unfortunately. The studies have a range of between 20 and 40% of American jobs subject to automation in the next 20 to 30 years, which is not that much time, and that's a lot of jobs. I've seen it in the industries that I've worked in, and we have to get our acts together. If we keep trying to respond to the symptoms and don't address the root causes, then our communities will continue to suffer.
Okay. Hethel, I know that in your job you think a lot about workforce development. What questions do you have for Mr. Yang about a universal basic income?
Yeah, so I mean, it's true that automation is taking away a lot of jobs, or I feel that automation is taking away a lot of jobs, but how does just providing $1,000 a month to each individual solve that problem?
In many ways, it does not solve that problem. But your nonprofit works with women of what age or children of what age?
High school students. We're trying to grow up as well, yeah.
So I ran a nonprofit for a number of years that I'd started. And do you think that your nonprofit would have access to more resources if every American was getting an additional $1,000 a month? So the money ends up supercharging not just existing businesses, but also spurs creativity, entrepreneurship, and risk-taking, because if you feel like your survival is assured, then you have a much higher chance of striking out and trying to do something on your own. It also supercharges nonprofits, volunteering, the arts, culture, many NPR probably, like many of the things that we value, but the market does not properly value. And I'm going to say that women and people of color actually fall into the same category that the market will systematically undervalue. Mm-hmm. And so if you say, and I know this because I started a nonprofit and worked there for a number of years, very proud of the work, and it continues to this day. But you realize that most nonprofits are trying to address some of the important issues at the margins, and you would need to fundamentally reconfigure the way our economy works if you're going to truly get into the guts of that problem. And the freedom dividend or universal basic income actually transforms the way of life for many Americans in a way that would make us more able to solve the real problems.
So,
Please.
I mean, how did you come up? I know part of your slogan is math. I mean, how did you come up with $1,000? Because $1,000 here in New York City or San Francisco is a lot different than anywhere else. So, as a nonprofit founder, $12,000 a year would go far, but it wouldn't go that far. So $12,000 was, first, it's not my number. It was proposed by a guy named Andy Stern and then studied by the Roosevelt Institute. So it was another proposal that had been vetted in various ways. But it does make sense on many levels because $12,000 a year is right below the U.S. poverty line, which is approximately $12,770 a year. So it moves you up to that level. And this is per adult, mind you. So if you have two adults in your household, it's $24,000 a year. So it moves you up and gets the pressure off, but it doesn't serve as a full work replacement where there's virtually no American who's like, oh, I'm going to quit my job. We got $1,000 a month. Like that. That's not really. I'm sure John here is like, like now ready to pack it in for $1,000 a month because, you have a family like I do, who I can see over your shoulder. So it's enough to be a game changer, would make us stronger, healthier, less stressed out, mentally healthier, would reduce domestic violence, reduce hospital visits, would dramatically increase the graduation rate and many positive social indicators. But it's not meant to be a full work replacement, and it's certainly not meant to solve every problem. I will suggest, though, that if you extrapolate like what the second order effects are, if you take a town of 10,000 adults in Missouri, and then they're each getting $1,000 a month,
that's $10 million in additional buying power every single month in that town, which ends up going to things like car repairs, daycare, Little League signups, local nonprofits. And so then if you've lost your truck driving job and you're in that town, there's a much greater chance that you can plug into existing opportunities because the local economy is much more robust.
But doesn't it, I mean, it's funded by your VAT tax. I mean, why not a wealth tax instead?
Actually, do you mind if we just get a little bit of clarity before we go into it?
For sure.
So I think I'm going to put words in your mouth here and have you ask the question, but I think what you want to ask is, how do you plan on paying for this? And I wondered if, before we get to that, I can just ask you, can I ask you to do some quick math for us?
Sure.
Okay. How many adults in the United States would be eligible for this $12,000 a year?
So if you were to take a broad number, about 200 million.
200 million times $12,000 a year.
2.4 trillion.
2.4 trillion a year this would cost. Okay. John, I know you have a question about that. Yes. Please go ahead.
Sure. So I think you said that you'd fund it with a VAT tax, which would I understand to be a tax, broadly across, consumption of goods, versus a wealth tax, which would be a tax on, the wealthiest Americans. So you have this great, kind of income inequality in the country, and it makes sense, at least superficially, that you sort of take from those who have the most and even it out, and that would seem to point to a wealth tax. So why a VAT tax instead?
And in your answer, I wonder if you could do this. Would you just explain as well what a VAT tax is? I think some of our listeners will be unfamiliar with that.
And I think I said this on the debate stage with Senator Warren. So a wealth tax makes perfect sense in principle, because you have this winner-take-all economy. You have historic levels of wealth in the hands of a relatively small number of Americans. And so I endorse the spirit of a wealth tax. The problem is that when they tried a wealth tax in France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and a half dozen other countries, they ended up repealing it because it didn't generate the revenue they thought it would, and they had massive implementation and compliance problems. And I believe the same thing would happen here, if anything, to a higher degree, because the wealthy in America are, I think, even more extreme in their tax avoidance practices.
But I mean, Warren has a 15% avoidance, kind of factor in there. So your assumption, right, that people are going to avoid their taxes. Also, our taxes are different than European taxes. And taxes is just kind of a problem to be solved, right?
Well,
I mean, couldn't you just simply change the tax code?
Or even if you buy everything, like the amount of money that Senator Warren's wealth tax is projected to raise, even in the most optimistic, is less than a third of what like even a mild VAT would raise, even if you assume that her assumptions are right.
Okay. Well,
do you buy it?
to raise what amount? I mean, to raise the same amount that you are suggesting?
Well, her VAT, as I understand it, her wealth tax is projected to raise something like 2.75 trillion over 10 years, which is like 275 billion a year. And the VAT I'm suggesting raises about 3 times that.
But isn't a VAT tax essentially regressive in the sense that everybody's paying the same tax, but if you're poorer, that dollar means a whole lot more to you, to buy food and essentials versus a dollar for someone who's a millionaire or billionaire.
So there are 3 things, and you're 100% right about everything you're saying. So the 3 things. Number 1, if you want to, you can tailor a VAT where you can exempt consumer staples and have it fall more heavily on luxury goods or certain industries. Number 2, we all know I'm trying to give every American $1,000 a month, which, even if you assumed a degree of impact from the VAT, would increase the buying power of the bottom 94% of Americans. But number 3, the fundamental challenge we have in the U.S. is that we have this tax system that is being gamed to incredible degrees. So you have a $1 trillion tech company like Amazon that's now closing 30% of America's stores and malls, literally paying 0 in taxes. And so you have to look around and say, okay, now that should not be. Most Americans could agree, like, you have a messed up system if that's the case. And then you look around the world and say, well, what have other developed countries done to prevent that from happening? And what they've done is they've had a VAT, which then gives every American a tiny share of every Amazon sale, every Google search, every Facebook ad, every robot truck mile. Because we're in an era of unprecedented technologies and innovation. Our data is now worth more than oil, as an example, and we're seeing none of that. The companies that are seeing that value are Amazon, Facebook, Google, and these mega tech companies, and they're experts at not paying taxes in a current corporate income tax regime. They're just too smart for it. They'll say, it all went through Ireland, or I just paid all my executives so much stock that I have no earnings to report. And so we're chasing our own tail. What we have to do is we have to actually get into where the money is, and that's where the money's going.
Let me ask you to define what a VAT, value-added tax, actually means. There will be people who are just unfamiliar with this as a concept. So I am used to, paying taxes on my salary, payroll taxes. At the end of the month, half my money is gone. What is a value-added tax, and how would it be different?
So a value-added tax, and again, not my idea. It's in use in over 100 major economies around the world, including Canada, Germany, France, the UK, Sweden. Like most any country that you think of as being very progressive has a value-added tax, and it's a tax on value transfers, which you can think of as what John said: consumption, sales. One difference between a VAT and a sales tax is it applies to the means of production. So if I built a car, for example, I would pay a VAT on every component of the car, and so it ends up being like oxygen in your business processes, where you can't escape it. It's one reason why other countries have put it into place. And so then if you had an Amazon type firm, there would be no escaping it for them either, because they would end up paying it during every link of the chain, and then we'd end up with hundreds of billions in revenue as a result.
So you would pay a tax on the steel that goes into the car, then you would pay a tax on the frame that the car is made out of, then you would pay a tax on the steering wheel when it's added into the car, then you would pay a tax on the seats when they're added into the car. You're saying that this is a tax that applies all through
business process,
all
yeah,
through the
supply
business
chain.
process.
Yeah.
Okay. And to John's point, and let me just, I'm going to put this in slightly elementary terms, but let's say I'm a low-income American,
Yep.
and or a middle-income American. Taxes are already killing me, and you're telling me there's this new tax, this VAT tax, with which that you want to institute so that you can pay for the freedom dividend. And I hear, oh God, this guy wants another tax. He wants to tax me more.
Well,
if I'm a lower middle-income person, are you saying I'm going to have to pay more taxes on food, on clothing, on cars?
It depends. I mean, if all you do is consume consumer staples, it's possible that you don't have to pay more.
Why not?
Because, again, you can tailor a value-added tax so that it falls heavily on certain types of consumption choices and not so heavily on others. Like you could exempt diapers, you could exempt a lot of things that I think Americans would say, like that we need. But the problem right now is that we're looking at each other, and the biggest myth in American life right now is that we don't have the money. We're the richest country in the history of humanity, over $20 trillion in GDP, up $5 trillion in the last 10 years. And so there's this incredibly untrue narrative, and it's punishing us all. We're looking around and saying, like, where's the money going? Where's the money going? The money is going into the hands of a smaller and smaller number of companies and individuals in this country, and they're so powerful that they actually manage to keep real reform off the agenda. And so that's where we have to fix it. We have to go to it. There's a saying where it's like, why did I rob the bank? Because that's where the money was. That's what's going on right now in our society. We have to go where the money is, and it's not each other. You know what I mean? It's not like if I tax the town dentist more, like that's going to solve the problem. Like the problem is that you have literally $1 trillion companies paying zero in taxes.
You're promising not to tax the town dentist more. You're promising not to tax diapers. What you're saying is things would be exempt, and you would figure out what's exempt.
Well, just any American listening to this right now is like thinking to themselves, if they know anything about me and they campaign, they're like, wow, $1,000 a month sounds too good to be true. That would be a real game changer. And if I am a family with 2 adults, like $24,000, and then if I know my son when they turn 18 or daughter, they get $1,000 a month, the entire thing transforms the idea of citizenship. And the wild thing is that we can totally make it happen. There's nothing stopping us from making it happen. Alaska's had a dividend for almost 40 years already, where if you go to Alaska, you get between $1,000 and $2,000 a year automatically for every family member. So, John, if you and your family moved to Alaska, you'd get $8,000 the next year. It's been in effect for 40 years. They love it, universally popular, in a deep red conservative state passed by a Republican governor, and they fund it with oil money. And what I'm saying to the American people is technology is the oil of the 21st century. We can fund this dividend that will make us stronger, healthier, mentally healthier. And if we don't make this kind of move, then we're going to be stuck looking at each other and wondering what the heck happened to our communities as the truck driving gets automated, the malls close, the call centers get replaced by bots and software. Every fast food restaurant you go into by 2021 is going to have a self-serve kiosk. At least every McDonald's is going to have a self-serve kiosk. Food service and preparation is the third most common job type in the United States. The fact is we're already decades behind the curve. It as broad as Donald Trump. And unless we get our heads up and start solving for the real problems, they're just going to get worse.
Well, I actually really genuinely enjoy your clear-eyed view of things. You know, you're not afraid to take.
Oh, thanks, John.
Well, you're not afraid to take a liberal stance and then kind of make these sort of harder choices at times. But I think you sort of see it as, or I don't know, maybe this is my question. Do you see the world in sort of, or America at least, as divided between sort of winners and losers? You know, the folks for whom, you know, whatever their privilege is, they wind up, you know, they have the education and they have the job, and therefore they have, you know, access to money, and then those who are sort of left out. And, you know, do you see it that way? And how do you kind of address that? And how do you kind of convince the winners to see themselves equally with the losers?
It's so interesting. Well, there's certainly winners and losers in American life today by our economic measurements. And you can see, again, we're in this winner-take-all economy where certain classes of Americans, often in certain parts of the country. And that's one of the things that blew my mind when I ran Venture for America, because I had never been to Missouri, Alabama, Louisiana, Western PA, like all these places. And you go around, you're like, wow, I feel like I'm in a different country. And the gulf between some of those places and, frankly, a place like Manhattan, where we are right now, doesn't feel like a few time zones. It feels like a different dimension, or, you know.
Yeah, I grew up in Wichita. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Oh, I was wondering where you grew up at. So, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And so there's certainly this class divide that is becoming more pronounced. But I think the regional divide and the urban-rural divide is becoming much more extreme. And that is threatening to tear us apart because rural areas are getting systematically depleted and sucked dry. Like the automation I'm talking about started in agriculture at the farms. And when you go to many of these farms, like the notion you might have of this beautiful family farm or whatnot, I mean, it's gotten replaced by this this corporate behemoth that's like gobbled up like a dozen family farms and glued them together. So the divide is more extreme, and the worst part is that we're being pitted against each other, often using various cultural markers that have nothing to do with the economics that actually should unify us all. Because if you have, and you're an attorney, I was an attorney for 5 unhappy months. So you could say it's like, hey, I'm an attorney, so you know I'm safe from these changes that Andrew's talking about. But you know that
I'm not.
That artificial intelligence can edit contracts and legal documents better, more quickly, more accurately, more cheaply.
Or even if it's not me, it's, you know, what about my kids? Maybe I'm winning now, but what does the future hold, right?
Yes. So this becomes something where it should bring us all together if we present it in the right way. It's not immigrants, it's technology, and it's humanity that we have to preserve.
Hethel, I've seen your eyebrows go up a couple times during this exchange, and I just want to ask what, based on what you've been hearing, what questions do you still have?
Yeah, so I mean, I had a couple of questions, which I guess you can choose which to answer. But how do you know that the big companies are not going to push that cost, the tax that they're going to be paying, back off onto the consumers? The freedom dividend, how do you, I mean, sure, we don't have to necessarily go into, you know, we can choose how to spend it, and you should be spending it on necessities, but you're going to make people choose, right? You're also seeking to pay for the freedom dividend at the cost of other programs.
I think we just need to explain that very briefly, and it's an important point. If a family currently is getting welfare payments, SNAP, food stamps, WIC, et cetera, and they're getting $700 a month in welfare, under your system, that would go away. I'd get that solid $1,000, but that's $700 in SNAP and food stamps. That's not mine anymore. So I think what Hethel is asking is, if you're taking away people's welfare payments and replacing it with $1,000, is that enough? Is that what you're getting at?
Right. I mean, you'd ideally hope, and this is again kind of with the vision, is the vision's great. I love the vision, right? But do people always make the choices that we need them to make in order to get to the world that you're hoping to get to?
I think this is maybe one of the bigger misconceptions about me and the freedom dividend is I see the freedom dividend as like a foundation or a floor. And then you don't stop building a house at the floor. It's kind of a crummy house, So first, I would not want to get rid of any existing government programs. I would never be the sort of person who says like, hey, there are millions of Americans relying upon something, let's pull the rug out from under them.
I would still keep getting my payments?
No, so there is an opt-in. The freedom dividend is universal and opt-in. And if you do opt into the freedom dividend, then you do forego benefits that are from certain programs that are cash and cash-like. But if you love your current benefits, or let's say you're receiving $1,800 in current benefits, then would never touch it. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that I'm not someone who says like, we don't need to do all these other things on top of it, because $1,000 a month is just a foundation. There's a lot of work to do on top of that, and to the extent that existing programs are doing that work, fantastic. To the extent that we need new programs and organizations, all the better. What's driving me is that, to me, and I feel like, and please don't let me project something that's inaccurate on you, but like I ran a nonprofit for 7 years, and people were congratulating me, and I was like, you don't get it. I'm just like scratching the surface of like the problem I'm trying to tackle. That's so to me, we have to do so much more. I would never suggest that $1,000 a month is going to do the work for us.
You were hinting at something, though, interesting, and I want to make sure that we have that answered, which is if you give people $1,000 a month cash, they may not make the right decisions. They may make dumb decisions. What do you do about that?
Of course, some people will make decisions that I personally would disagree with. But one of the things that never happens when Verizon or Coke or Microsoft declares a dividend, which they do all the time, and we applaud them and say, nice job, like good management, they never say, hey, what are you doing with that money? You know what I mean? Like we are the owners and shareholders of the democracy. If you get the freedom dividend in January and you buy a big TV, like maybe I wouldn't have bought that big TV, but it's your decision, it's your resources, and then hopefully you'll make it, or not even hopefully, it's like you might make a different decision in February. The benefits to me of putting this sort of agency and autonomy in people's hands far outweigh trying to direct it to very, very specific expenses. But I will say again that we still need to do a lot of work to address the real problems in our society on top of anything we're doing with the freedom dividend.
And that's kind of what I want to get at next is the issue of inequity, right? So if they're not necessarily, we're not mandating them, we're not prescribing how they spend that money, but then again, is $1,000 enough to really address inequities? Or how are you looking to address inequities? Yes, there's a lot of work to be done. I haven't heard enough about what that is. So what's the next work besides a freedom dividend? How do you address inequities in education and healthcare? How do you actually address it?
Housing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which one do you want me to tackle? Really,
Whichever one.
like
Yeah. I mean, I'm focused on education, so.
So first, the data shows that 2/3 of our kids' academic performance is determined by factors outside of the school. So that's parental time spent with the children, words read to them when they're young, stress levels in the household, type of neighborhood. And educators know this, where we're saying, teach our kids, and they're like, yeah, I'm responsible, or I can control about 1/3 of what goes on to the kid. They're like, well, you're 100% accountable, and they're like, okay. So number one, if you put resources into the household, you're actually getting the kids in a better position to learn, and then helping the teachers be in a better position to teach. So that's number one, and to me, that's foundational, and that ends up balancing out more aggressively for communities that are starting at a lower base, which tends to be, unfortunately, communities of color in this country. Number two, the data clearly shows that a good teacher is worth his or her weight in gold, so we should pay teachers more. And $12,000 a year raise would just be a start. We need to retain and enlist better teachers. There are so many teachers who are leaving the classroom because of burnout and the rest of it. Relatedly, we need more teachers. Data also shows that having individualized attention, very, very positive for kids. Having lower student-to-teacher ratio is very, very positive. So we need to staff up. The fourth thing is we need to lighten the emphasis on standardized tests that right now is making our teachers make these choices in the classroom where they know that it's not good for the kid, but they're like, well, I'm going to get evaluated on this test, and the kid's going to get evaluated on this test, so let's head to this direction. And one of my boys is autistic, and so he's neurologically atypical. And while that's relatively extreme, there are many atypical kids in our schools today that are just getting beaten over the head with these standardized tests, and and many of them are having their self-esteem crushed and their hopes for the future altered forever. We invented the SAT during World War II as a means to determine which kids not to send to the front lines. And now we're using it every year like it's wartime. And we're treating our kids like it's wartime every year. So we need to de-emphasize these tests and let the teachers actually do their jobs. So that would be enormous. We have to stop pretending that every kid's going to go to college. Only a third of Americans are going to graduate from college, and that's relatively stable. Like, it hasn't gone up from like 20 to 33% or anything like that. Like, it's gone like 30. It's relatively stable. So we should stop presenting college as the end-all be-all to our high school kids in particular and say, look, technical, apprenticeship, vocational programs are very, very, very stable careers in many cases. Only 6% of American high school students are in vocational and technical and apprenticeship right now. In Germany, that's 59%. Think about that gulf. And there are many of those jobs that are going to stand the test of time. It's very hard to automate away a plumber or an HVAC repair person. Can you imagine having a robot do that? Very, very hard. So we need to invest. And as usual, it's the harder thing, because even after I'm president, I say, all right, let's invest in vocational. You can't just conjure up like a shop and technical training, like in a school. Like, it's much easier just to have like some textbooks in that classroom. It's cheaper too. So if you try and do the right thing by our kids, it's going to be a higher degree of investment, but it's the right thing to do. So these are some of the things I believe we should do in education that would help alleviate some of the pervasive inequities.
Did you want to go with the last question?
Go ahead.
Okay, we're going to shift topics in a second, but I wanted to ask you both. You both had some very pointed questions about the freedom dividend, about the $1,000 a month. Are you convinced? Are you more convinced now than you were when you walked in here, based on what Mr. Yang has said and explained?
If you're a little bit more subtle with a value-added tax, right, and you're excluding products and that sort of thing, I think it helps. I don't see why you have to make the decision between SNAP, say, and getting the dividend. It seems to me it should just, right, because the wealthier person's, the person who doesn't need it. In my little community in, suburban New Jersey, I just imagine it going into, well, I can just buy a bigger house. That's $1,000 a month. I can put it into my mortgage or my rent or whatever, and housing prices will just go up in this, relatively, desirable location, and further kind of, you're making the price of entry, more difficult for people to attain. So, if you can just kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
So, what's great, John, is that by the math, $1,000 a month makes a much, much bigger difference to people who are coming from a lower base.
Sure.
So if I'm making $24,000 a year and you give me $12,000 additional, it's like a 50% increase. If I'm making $200,000, it's a 6% increase. So if you're worried that it's just going to exacerbate the incredible inequality in our society, by the math, it will actually diminish it greatly. And if you look at Alaska, where they're getting $1,000 to $2,000 a year for every adult, it's significantly diminishing. They're actually technically the least unequal state in the country, I believe, in large part because the dividend just flattens it all out.
All right, let me ask whether you're convinced by what you've heard today.
Sure. I guess I just also had a follow-up to that. why not just set a threshold? Like people below this income or household income will get $1,000 and people above will not. Why not just do that instead of, I mean, so for someone like me, sure, it could go a long way, especially for student loans. That's what I would be paying towards.
I'd try and zero out some of those student loans anyway, by
Perfect.
the way. So you get to
Yes.
keep some of that money.
To that.
But
keep going,
frankly,
sorry.
you're unconvinced. Yeah, keep going.
But yeah, I mean, it would go directly to those kinds of costs, right? I'm not going to go buy the next iPhone for $1,000, but not everybody's going to make that decision. So it may continue to increase, or it may further some inequities, right? Not because you want it to, but it just may happen. Why not just set that?
Yeah, no, so there's definitely a legit argument for some kind of income threshold, but I've been convinced that the benefits of universality are actually enough so we should head that direction. So just to use the Alaska example again, everyone gets the oil dividend from the richest Alaskan to the poorest Alaskan. And so what this does is it gets rid of all stigma attached to it. It makes it much more popular. It seems fair. There's no rich to poor transfer, and there's no monitoring requirement, which ends up lightening the bureaucracy. And there's no incentive to report that you made less money than you did. So if it was dependent upon individual income, you'd have a lot of people being like, hey, how about maybe let's not get married so that you can be over there and get the dividend, and then I'll that there'd be some games playing. Whereas if you just say, look, you're an American, you get it, starting age 18, and my system would end up extracting hundreds of millions, let's say billions, from someone like Jeff Bezos. So if we try and send him $1,000 a month to remind him he's an American, it's fine. If someone's really at the top of society, we're going to be extracting a lot of value from them, as it should be.
In that value-added tax, that's the
Yeah, because if you have
solution.
a significant value-added tax that, let's say, is even sharper on luxury goods, and then you have someone who's really wealthy in our society, we're going to get a ton from them. And then if you say, hey, you want your $1,000 a month, then it'll be trivial in the scheme of the value we're getting.
All right, we have been talking about the country's economic future, but I know that both of our voters, John and Hethel, have some questions about climate change. So you have put forward a very long and detailed proposal, about 50 pages, on what you would do to solve the problem of climate change now and in the near future. John, this is something that's been weighing pretty heavily on your mind. I wonder if you can tell us why that is and what you'd like to know from Mr. Yang.
I mean, it's, you hear everybody talking about it. It's an existential threat, and that's not just some little
Turn of phrase, yeah.
It's a reality.
You have kids?
It has to be addressed before everything else, because we're just not going to exist. You're going to have, climate refugees, a kind of human catastrophe that's greater than the history of slavery or the Holocaust all of the Holocausts during the 20th century. I mean, it's a massive, massive problem. So it weighs on me heavily. Again, I feel like your thinking is very clear-eyed. It's bold, and I appreciate the notion of moving folks to higher ground because we're in it.
We already have climate refugees in this country now.
Yeah. So you do include nuclear in your plan. You also are interested in investing in thorium and nuclear fusion, which I think is interesting.
And which we'll have to have you explain.
Yes. So if you can sort of, my concern about nuclear is the long-term nuclear waste problem, where
of course,
it sits around for 10,000 years. It's sort of hard for
I'm
humans
happy to say
conceive.
that thorium decomposes faster.
Yeah, so I've been reading about it, and it's remarkable, right? I mean, that's more in a human timescale. But why continue to have traditional nuclear in the portfolio? Why not sunset that very quickly and move in toward sustainables and thorium research, say?
So first, I want to say there is no solving the problem of climate change. I think that's what you'd said. There is, you can't turn back time. I mean, it's with us now. It's already changing lives and destroying lives. I was just in New Hampshire running for president. And hundreds of coastal houses and buildings are already flooding regularly. They had a multi-million-dollar shrimping business outside of Portsmouth that went to zero because of warming waters. It's already changing and devastating communities and ways of life around the country, and we haven't seen the worst of it. The last 4 years have been the 4 warmest years in recorded history. July was the warmest month in recorded history. I think you probably saw me on the debate stage in Detroit saying it's too late. It's like worse than you think. So it's too late to reverse climate change. Like the Earth will warm, sea levels will rise. We have to start trying to mitigate some of the worst effects. So where to begin? I mean, I have a long plan, as you said.
You have a very long plan. But John is actually really interested in why do you want to remain reliant on nuclear energy? And you have proposed something that not a lot of people have heard of, which is this thing called thorium, which you see as the way forward on climate change and on energy production.
So science fiction.
It does sound so science fiction-y, and I guarantee you a lot of our listeners will not have heard of it. Can you briefly just explain what is thorium and why does it go part of the way toward helping with climate change?
So thorium is a next generation fuel for a nuclear reactor, and it's superior to uranium on many levels. One is it's not intrinsically radioactive on its own, so that's great. Two, you can't make weapons out of it. So that's
which is true. That's a real thing. And
yeah.
You said it offhandedly, but I was researching thorium this morning, and yes, it is not used for nuclear weapons. Yeah.
It does decompose more quickly, and so it has many benefits, and the energy productivity can be as high or higher. And so why haven't we done it? I mean, we need to invest in these next generation nuclear reactors, and there's been a lot of angst about proceeding in this direction. To me, if we're in a crisis, which we are, then you have to consider every alternative on the table, and thorium and nuclear has to be at least on the table in my mind. If we get it right, it could be a tremendous boost in moving us towards more sustainable forms of energy and like reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and things that are speeding up climate change. So I'm excited about the potential. Some of the people I've spoken to are also excited about the potential. And this is the kind of bet that we would need to make if we're serious about trying to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels without, frankly, dramatically changing the energy consumption in this country, because we consume a lot of energy. And I think we can get there, but we can only get there if we're willing to consider every alternative.
How do you challenge Americans to consume less energy? And more specifically, from what I've read, it's the folks at the top of the economic ladder that actually, burn the most fuel.
Well, you probably saw that Elon Musk endorsed me. So I think we need to move to electric cars. We need to try and just lower people's carbon footprint to just do the things they do in everyday life. So that's investing in public transportation and electric cars and buses, things that will enable us to do what we want to do, but just burn less fuel and make less of an impact.
Hevel, I want to allow you to get a question in here.
How are you going to, those who don't believe in climate change, because there's a lot of them, how are you going to reach out to those people?
You probably know it's like I have a math hat, and so I should probably wear a science hat someplace. But I think there's a growing consensus around the urgency of climate change, certainly in the Democratic Party. The folks who don't believe in climate change, I think many of them have their heads down, in part because we're in a country where 78% of us are living paycheck to paycheck and almost half can't afford an unexpected $400 bill. So if I come to you and say, hey, we need to worry about climate change, you have your head down and you're like, I can't even pay next month's rent. Like, climate change is hokum or something, So a lot of it is getting Americans' heads up. And to me, a lot of that is getting the boot off of people's throats so that they can actually think more clearly and hopefully optimistically about the future. Studies have shown that if you can't pay your bills, it has the functional impact of decreasing your IQ by 13 points, or one standard deviation almost. So if you feel like there are a lot of Americans who seem more insular and negative and pessimistic and less future-oriented, that's probably factually accurate, because so many of us are just so stressed out about meeting next month's rent and living paycheck to paycheck that it's making us less rational and less optimistic.
But that's great for the people. How about reaching across the aisle? How are you going to do that?
Well, I mean, I suppose that's what I meant is that, well, so I'm one of only two Democratic candidates in the field that 10% or more of Donald Trump voters say they would support in the general election, which makes me the best candidate to take on and beat Donald Trump in 2020. And the folks on the other side of the aisle, I'm clearly a Democrat, everyone knows that, but the folks on the other side of the aisle see that I'm focused on trying to solve problems that affect them and all of us, that I'm not judging anyone, that I'm saying, look, the reality is we did blast away 4 million manufacturing jobs in these communities, many of which were in swing states, or used to be swing, that went red. And so they see that I'm trying to solve that set of problems. There's even a group called Truckers for Yang. Mm-hmm. Truckers are not really like traditionally a Democratic leaning group, but they see that I'm trying to solve their problems because I think there are problems. If we truly do blast away hundreds of thousands of trucking jobs, that's going to be an everyone problem. And so I'm already peeling off disaffected Trump voters, independents, libertarians, some conservatives. I also talk in terms of numbers and business, and a lot of conservatives are attracted to that.
Yeah, I mean, no, I'm drawing a blank right now. I guess I've seen. Did you convince me?
I want to ask if yes, I would actually like to
question.
follow
I have to
quickly
say, I feel a lot of pressure.
on climate change, whether either of you was convinced. So you are concerned about using nuclear as a form of energy, and nuclear replacing coal, for example. Mr. Yang has explained to some extent that he sees nuclear as the way forward, that thorium is even
It's
safer
a way
than
forward.
uranium, way forward. Are you convinced?
Well, I mean, what about phasing out traditional nuclear, like in a much
not
more
convinced.
expedited pace?
If we succeed in developing these next generation reactors and like traditional reactors aren't necessary, then I'd be thrilled. I mean,
Right.
if you can improve the let's say the composition of like the like our energy infrastructure, to me that's not like the lowest hanging fruit. Like fossil fuels and fracking and a bunch of other stuff would be the lower hanging fruit.
Eliminating those first, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, yeah, now I'm drawing a blank. Hang on.
Hazel, are you convinced? I mean, one thing that I'd point out, and maybe I'm throwing a question to you that you can throw to Mr. Yang, but one part of your policy proposal is simply moving people to higher ground. Hazel, you work with a lot of low-income people who do not have the luxury of saying, I'm going to pack up my apartment and I'm simply going to move inland, upstate, to the mountains. I wonder, could you ask Mr. Yang a question about how this applies to, how moving to higher ground applies to low-income people?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the question. But yeah, it's, I guess, I see that you're placing a lot of importance on climate change, and that's great, but I still don't see the plan.
So the plan is a 5-part plan that, and you're right, I didn't go through the plan in detail. I just talked about thorium. So one aspect of it is move people to higher ground, and that has at least 2 major components. So when there's a natural disaster, who suffers? Poor people, people of color, people who don't have the resources to protect themselves. So they might not even have a car to get into, to drive away. And so first, put $1,000 a month into everyone's hands. It makes us more able to protect ourselves if there is like a natural disaster that it would be beneficial to have an automobile or something like that. But then we need to invest tens, hundreds of billions of dollars in making our communities more resilient to climate change. It's a situation where if you spend $10 billion now, you might save yourself $50 billion later. That's not really the American way right now. The American way is to wait until you have to spend the $50 billion, and then there's one house that we have rebuilt 20 times, as an example. Not in whole, but like in part. Like it keeps getting damaged or destroyed. And I think most Americans would say, hey, if it'd make more sense just to rebuild that house someplace else, and the owner. So part of this is that many Americans do not want to move, and we as a country are not the types to be like, hey, we're going to force you to move. Like that's not really our style. We did already relocate a village in rural Louisiana that has become uninhabitable because of climate change, and that their ocean level rose to a point where he said, hey, this is not working, and then we moved them. So we're starting to do it, and we need to do much more of that. There is a lot of value if you can in some cases, elevate certain structures or elevate levees or to start preparing for higher sea levels. So that's what move people to higher ground is. It's not literal. It's not like everyone is going to go to the mountain. But it's let's try and make our communities genuinely more resilient and prepare for what we know is coming.
So when you say you moved them to higher ground, we moved them to higher ground, who's we? And then you also said that if you give them the freedom dividend, they'd have resources to
Just every American would at
themselves
least have
as well.
some basic resources. Yeah.
So are you expecting them to tap into their freedom dividend to also prepare themselves, or is there money in your plan for this?
Oh, there's a lot of additional ones. So freedom dividends, again, are foundation. And then we have literally hundreds of billions of dollars that we need to funnel to communities to help make them more resilient and direct them. And in some cases, that could be like a town government coming together and saying, hey, the best move might be for us to move this town. So it's not like an every person for themselves sort of situation. Like the freedom dividend, though I will suggest that if you give an American a choice, say, hey, would you rather I send you $1,000 a month to make you safer, or there'll be some government program to make you safer? Most of them would be like $1,000, please, because I'm pretty sure I'd be able to use that to, like put some boards up or do something that I know is going to make me safer. So it's a both and. Like I just want to solve the problem, but you certainly wouldn't to leave people on their own.
I'm being told that we only have about 5 or 10 minutes left.
That's terrible.
It is terrible. It is terrible. But there are a couple of questions that I do need to ask for NPR.
Okay.
And then you guys are welcome to follow. One of them is actually yours. But the impeachment inquiry being conducted by the Democrats, do you think this is the right way to go? Where do you stand on impeachment?
I think impeachment is the right way to go, but I do not think that we should have any illusions that it's necessarily going to be successful. And
in the Senate, you mean?
In the Senate. And when we are talking about Donald Trump, we are losing to Donald Trump. Even if it's in the context of talking about impeaching him, we need to take that opportunity to present a new vision for the country that Americans can get excited about. That's how we move the country forward. That's how we'll win in 2020.
All right, Hethel, I know you had a question about Mr. Yang's identity and what it's meant on the trail.
So cool.
So you say, what's the complete opposite of, other than an Asian man who knows math, right? That's
Likes
your
math,
slogan, likes
yeah.
math. Knows math, it should be knows math too. But how do you, being a South Asian, being someone of Indian descent,
You are.
Yes, I am. So you'd be the first Asian American president. What does that mean, first of all? And then also Asian American is such a big label.
Yeah, that's true.
Not every Asian has the same opportunities. Vietnamese are different, Pakistanis from Indians, etc. So how do you disaggregate that data? But yeah, within your identity, what are you going to do to promote Asian American?
I also grew up the child of immigrants, so I feel like you and I might have a lot in common. I'm certainly very proud to be the first Asian American man to run for president as a Democrat. And when I see Asian Americans around the country, many seem excited about my candidacy. At the same time, like you said, we're a very, very diverse community with very, very different sets of experiences. And so I would never suggest that I can somehow speak for all Asian Americans or that my experience is representative. But I do remember what it was like growing up in this country, where I'd just be so pumped to see an Asian of any kind on the TV, where I'd jump up and down and try and get my, things have changed since then. But it's given me a lot of joy and pride to think about an Asian child turning on the Democratic debate and seeing me up on that stage, and hopefully it gives them a sense that that we're just as American as anyone else.
I wanted to ask you a question about your candidacy. Nationally, you're polling at about 2%.
A little higher than that.
Little higher than that.
Come on.
John and Hethel, feel free to follow up on this. Are you running for president to win? Or are you running for president to introduce ideas into the conversation, like our jobs are being lost to automation, and we need to start talking about unheard of things like universal basic income, unusual things, new things like universal basic income, like using thorium to make energy. Are you running to win? And do you think you can win?
Oh, I 100% can win.
Yeah?
The prediction markets have me as the third most likely to be the nominee right now. I raised $10 million in the last quarter, and all of our measurements are just going through the roof. So you'll see that we'll be there competing at the very highest levels the whole time. One thing I will say is that this is certainly not a new set of ideas. Martin Luther King championed universal basic income.
So did Richard Nixon for a time.
Yeah, Richard Nixon, Thomas Paine. So it's been with us for decades. It's just now more vital than ever. But I'm running to solve the biggest problems of our time. I'm on the record saying if I thought these problems would get solved without my being president, I would be pumped.
If someone else could pull it off.
But it seems that the most effective way to make these solutions happen will be for me to win, and that is the plan.
John Heffel, why don't you follow up on that?
I don't know. I just I still can't get around why you're so averse to a wealth tax. That still sticks. I mean, I understand that you, in principle and philosophically, agree with it.
Yeah.
But the idea, I mean, you're a guy who's like, look, let's solve the problem. Let's come up with some really big ideas. And I just don't feel like, the rich are just going to avoid the tax. It's too hard. We're not going to do it. That doesn't seem like you.
I like to consider myself very fact and data driven. And so if a solution was tried in a host of other countries that I think of as pretty smart countries like Denmark and Sweden and France and Germany, and then they ended up saying, like, this is actually so bad that we're going to repeal it. Like, I take that set of experiences as very compelling. Mm-hmm. If you can't learn from other people's mistakes, then you're kind of putting yourself in a tough spot. But I'm philosophically not opposed to it. And if I was president and it passed Congress and it's like, hey, it's wealth tax time, and I thought it would be somewhat effective, it's not that, I just don't think it's the best idea, but it's like I see why everyone's supporting it. Let's put it that way.
And I mean, you clearly have great ideas. That's why we're both here. Love the ideas.
Oh, thank you. Maybe you guys got picked out of random. Be like, oh, we got stuck with Yang.
No,
I was
your
hoping for
ideas-
another candidate.
Ideas are great, like you said, like John said, like clear-eyed. It's great, but in the case that you don't become president, how are you going to continue to work on these ideas to make sure that we're addressing everything we've discussed?
These problems are going to be with us no matter what, and I'm very confident I'll have a lot of work to do, whether it's as president or in some other capacity. But I'm a parent like you are, John, and I see the future we're leaving for our kids, and I find it to be unacceptable. And so I'm going to work my heart out to try and make it better.
As we wrap, I'll just ask you lastly, would you be interested in Commerce Secretary?
No, I'm open to contributing in any of a range of roles. I've spent time with the other candidates, and there are many people I could work with.
I thought you were going to laugh, but you didn't, and I like that. All right. Entrepreneur Andrew Yang, thank you so much. Entrepreneur and presidential candidate Andrew Yang, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. I enjoyed it immensely.
And I want to thank our voters, Heffel Johnny and John Zeitler. Thank you both for coming out today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.